Hi, this is David Farkas with Red Dot Forum. Earlier this week, Leica officially added a new camera to its lineup, the Leica Q2 Monochrom. I was lucky enough to get my hands on an early sample and take it for a spin. In this video, we'll cover what sets the new camera apart from the standard Q2, how it stacks up against the reigning king, the M10 Monochrom, and take a look at some real-world sample images that I shot over the last few days. So stick around. The Q2 Monochrom joins a pantheon of iconic digital black and white cameras from Leica, but is the first of its kind, being based off the Q and not an M. The first M Monochrom was introduced in May of 2012. I was actually at that event in Berlin when Leica shocked the photo world with the then crazy idea of a digital camera that only shot black and white. Look, as most photographers know, a single click in Lightroom or Photoshop and your color files can be turned into quite nice black and whites. But shooting with the camera after the event and comparing it to my then M9, from which the M Monochrom was based, I immediately realized the advantages. And others got the message as well. The monochrome concept was an overwhelming success, leading to 2 more generations since. The latest edition, the M10 Monochrom, sets new standards in detail resolution and high ISO performance. If you haven't seen it, you can check out my overview and real-world shooting video up here. I'll also leave links to the video in the description below. I've covered this extensively in my other videos and in various monochrome reviews and ISO Shogun articles on Red Dot Forum. Again, check out the links in the video description, but I still think it's worth a quick recap. See, all sensors in digital cameras are inherently black and white capture devices. It's only through the addition of something called a Bayer color filter array that cameras can delineate color. Think of this array as a checkerboard of color filters. 50% green, 25% red, and 25% blue. Because each pixel in a color image is only recording one single color, a file must undergo a process called demosaicing, whereby an algorithm is applied to interpolate the missing 2/3 of the color information. And the method works quite well. It also creates some issues. Just like color filters you might mount on your lens, the tiny filters over the individual pixels block light to varying degrees, limiting the sensitivity of the sensor. In a monochrome camera, the color filter array is removed, resulting in 3 very distinct advantages. First, the sensor is more sensitive to light, boosting base ISO by a stop. And because every pixel gains up uniformly, instead of on a per color channel basis, noise is reduced and what remains is far more uniform. As with other monochrome versions, the Q2 boasts a 1.5 to 2 stop ISO advantage over its color sibling, the Q2. So where the Q2 tops out at 50,000 ISO, the Q2 Monochrom now offers an ISO range of 100 to 100,000, and it will be cleaner at each comparable setting. Now, because there is no need to apply a demosaicing algorithm, the camera isn't relying on any interpolation whatsoever. This results in much sharper, more detailed images at the same pixel resolution. How much sharper? Well, this is debatable, but expect an improvement of around 20 to 30%. All right. Lesson over. Again, if you want to learn more about monochrome versus color, see the links below. Now let's take a look at how the new camera compares to the standard Q2. Let's start with what these cameras have in common. Being based on the Q2 Monochrom shares just about every great feature of its color counterpart. One of the most defining characteristics of all Q models to date is the outstanding 28mm f1.7 Summilux aspheric lens, which is bolted permanently to the front of the camera. The lens offers incredible resolving power from wide open on with lovely bokeh and a minimum focus of just 30 centimeters in normal mode. A quick turn of a ring on the lens engages the macro mode, where the minimum focus distance is reduced to just 17 centimeters. The close focus and utterly addictive macro mode add a level of flexibility not usually found on full-frame wide-angle lenses. And while lens changing is off the table here, tapping the button on the back of the camera allows you to toggle between the digital crop modes of 35, 50, and 75. Keep in mind that these are not optical zoom options as the lens remains a fixed 28, so you will be sacrificing some pixels. This shouldn't be too much of an issue because the Q2 Monochrom packs a whopping 47 megapixel full-frame CMOS sensor into its compact body. Here you can see the resulting resolution of each of the digital zoom settings. It's worth noting that you still get 30 megapixels at the 35mm setting, which is more than native resolution of the first generation Q and more than enough to print just about any size you might want to. Now, when shooting in DNG, the cropping metadata is passed to Lightroom and comes in pre-cropped, but the full image is still retained, so you can always fine-tune the cropping after the fact. The monochrome sensor at the heart of the camera is based on the same underlying silicon as the Q2, but according to Leica is a newly developed chip. Notably, the microlens structure has been revised for even greater optimization between the sensor and the lens. Of course, the sensor forgoes the color filter array, as we already discussed, as well as no low-pass filter, both of which result in staggeringly detailed images. We've got the same intuitive operational concept that makes the Q2 such a pleasure to use. Aperture, focus, and macro mode rings are located right on the lens. On top of the camera, we have a shutter speed dial and a thumb wheel with an assignable central function button. And for me, I have ISO and EV control in one. Menu options are quickly available on the responsive touchscreen or by using the buttons. Really, this design direction by Leica is just so straightforward and effortless. It makes adjusting aperture or exposure compensation or ducking into macro mode a breeze. And as with the Q2, a half press of the shutter activates autofocus and provides a live depth of field preview. For image composition, we've got the same built-in bright and clear 3.68 million dot OLED EVF with adjustable diopter, as well as the 1 million dot 3-inch rear touchscreen. While the viewfinder is top-notch, I often find myself using the rear LCD when shooting low down or at odd angles, and it works great. Turning on Touch AF when using the LCD makes the setup even more intuitive. Styling on the Q2 monochrome follows the design cues of the M10 monochrome, more than a stock Q2. The camera is extra discreet with its matte black painted finish and shares the same super classy mid-grain leatherette as the M10 Mono. All the markings on the lens and shutter speed dial forego the usual colors, also getting the purely monochromatic treatment. There's no red Leica logo on the front of the camera, nor any white engraving on the top plate, just a black-on-black engraved monochrome in all caps in front of the hot shoe. And I gotta say, it looks awesome. On the bottom of the camera, we've still got the metal card door covering the SD card slot, and the identical BP SEL4 found in Q2 and SL cameras. Beyond the stealthy looks, the camera is incredibly quiet, thanks to the inconspicuous leaf shutter in the lens. And if near silence doesn't cut it, you can always opt to switch over to the electronic shutter for completely silent operation. Of course, the electronic shutter serves another important function as well, allowing shutter speeds up to 1/40,000th of a second, well beyond the 2,000th of a second limit on the mechanical shutter. This means that you can shoot wide open to your heart's content without ever having to reach for an ND filter in bright light. And of course, both the Q2 and the Q2 monochrome are weather and dust sealed with an IP52 rating for when the weather turns foul. Okay, so the Q2 monochrome is great. It's fast, fun, and turns out ridiculously good image quality. But how does it stack up against some of its Leica siblings? We could certainly go down the rabbit hole on this one, so let's just focus our efforts on looking at the standard Q2 and the M10 monochrome. In many ways, the Q2 monochrome is almost a perfect blend of these two amazing cameras. We've covered a fair amount of the differences and similarities between the Q2 and the Q2 monochrome already, so let's just bottom line it here. The Q2 provides a color image, which can always be converted to black and white, but the Q2 monochrome is purpose-built with a monochrome sensor. That gives it an easy two-stop advantage for ISO performance and low light ability, as well as around a 20 to 30% lead in detail resolution. All the other features remain largely the same. The obvious sacrifice? Well, if you shoot with the Q2 Mono, you're giving up the possibility of color images. But if that's your jam and you love black and white, the Q2 Monochrom looks like the way to go. Now moving on to the big gun, the M10 Monochrom. With its 40 megapixel dual gain CMOS sensor and access to legendary Leica M glass, the M10 Mono is a low light and image quality powerhouse. So is it still better than the newcomer? Well, that depends on how we define better. Does the M10 Monochrom offer superior image quality? Yes, to my eye it does, especially when paired with lenses like the 50mm Apo Summicron. And the high ISO capability is about a stop better than the Q2 Monochroms. But the M is a completely separate experience altogether. First of all, the M is an interchangeable lens camera, right, with countless glass options from the last 60 years. On the Q, you have one focal length, digital zoom, and your feet. The M gives you choices. Now for some, that can be a plus. For others, not as much. If you're the type of photographer who wants to choose from a variety of focal lengths, the M10 Monochrom would be a better way to go, especially if you're looking for ultra-wide or longer telephoto options. On the Q2 Monochrom, there simply aren't available. But if you're looking to pare down, simplify, and are happy shooting with the versatile 28mm on the Q, and okay with digital cropping to 35 or even 50 on occasion, the Q2 might be the better choice. Because while the M is an icon, it does have a steeper learning curve and requires more attention to technique. The M, after all, is an optical rangefinder with manual focus only. The Q is an all-in-one mirrorless with autofocus, so it's inherently easier. Now there is an available EVF that slides into the hot shoe for live view on the M, but it's not as good as the fantastic EVF built right into the Q. And in terms of speed, ease of use, and fun factor, the Q is hard to beat. And of course, there's the issue of cost. The Q2 Monochrom comes in just under $6,000 and includes the amazing 28mm Lux. As we like to joke, you pay for the lens and you get the camera for free, or vice versa, whichever you feel better about. The M10 Monochrom lands at around $8,300, not including a lens. Add in a current generation Leica lens, and the entry fee rises well above $10K. And if you wanted a 28mm Summilux, like the one on the Q, add in another $7,000 and change, bringing the total up to over $15,000. Put into perspective, the Q2 Monochrom is actually quite a value here. Now, if you already have a collection of M lenses and or prefer the purity of the rangefinder experience, well, I'd probably push you to the M10 Mono. Really, I could make a case for either camera, as they are simply incredible performers, offering either ease of use and quickness with the Q, or the coveted rangefinder experience and glass options on the M. Both offer insane black and white image quality, with the edge going to the M10 Mono, but the Q2 Monochrom's not far behind. My recommendation ultimately would come down to your shooting style and what you had in your existing kit. If you want to pose a question, leave it in the comment and I'll see if I can answer it. So I had the chance to take the Q2 Monochrom out shooting. Unfortunately, the timing wasn't great, because right after I received the camera for testing, Tropical Storm Eta decided to rain on my parade. Literally. The camera might be weather sealed, and I've never let a little rain stop me before, but a tropical storm threatening to become a full-blown hurricane is no joke. I tried to make the best of it, sneaking out into my backyard during a brief break in the weather to play with some natural details in macro. The next afternoon, when the worst of the storm had finally passed, I headed to downtown Fort Lauderdale for some urban landscape. Then, as evening set in, I wandered along the beachfront for some night photography. Shooting with a camera is fun and spontaneous. It's essentially a very, very high quality point and shoot. And while this might come off sounding a bit cliche, the whole experience put a big smile on my face. I felt like a little kid with a new toy, marveling at how simple it was just to play around and experiment. I'm no stranger to M photography, and there really are very few cameras that are as satisfying to shoot as an M10, but wow, this Q2 Monochrom is just so enjoyable. There was nothing to get frustrated with. The close focus and macro functionality are so addictive, with the lens and sensor combo turning even the most basic objects into art in real time. Crisp details, luscious and smooth bokeh, and composing in the gorgeous EVF made things that much simpler. Carrying just the Q2 Monochrom and an extra battery, I was completely unencumbered when wandering around. Battery life was excellent. On each of my outings, I never dipped below 50%, but I'd still recommend carrying an extra just in case. Importing the images into Lightroom, I was equally pleased. The files took a little bit of trial and error to get the hang of, requiring a little different approach than with either the Q2 or the M10 Monochrom. This isn't a bad thing, again, just different. And like any monochrome camera before, there's much more dynamic range to be had in the shadows than in the highlights, particularly at lower ISO settings. So as a matter of course, I found that running -1 EV usually resulted in the best overall images. High ISO is excellent. For daytime shooting, I set my auto ISO maximum to 6400 and didn't think twice about where it would land. The setting resulted in little to no visible noise on any image, with plenty of capability to push the files in post. For low light night photography, I upped the max setting to ISO 50,000. I knew that going all the way to the limit of 100,000 was probably not going to be great, but I was really curious on how the Q2 Monochrom would do at some still fairly high ISO numbers. And I was impressed. My shooting was very evenly spread out between ISO 1600 and 50,000, so I got a nice sampling. With good exposures that don't require too much tweaking, you can shoot all the way up to ISO 50,000. But when shooting at these very high settings, don't expect the same kind of post-processing malleability as you get at the lower end of the range. Here, out-of-camera results look impressively good with punchy contrast and rich tonality. Of course, that being said, I was still able to bump the exposure 1 to 2 stops in Lightroom on most images and still get some very usable pictures. At low ISO, the resulting captures have tons of dynamic range and rich tonal gradations, with quality rivaling 4x5 sheet film. And at high ISO, you get bold, film-like images. We'll be doing a more controlled studio test of the Q2 versus the Q2 Monochrom at every ISO, so you want to stay tuned for that. So what are my final thoughts on the Leica Q2 Monochrom? It's small and light, feels great in the hand, it's simple and intuitive to use, and turns out astounding image quality. There's really nothing like it. The lens isn't just a good lens on this camera, it's one of the finest and fastest wide angles currently offered by Leica. The macro and crop functions make it much more flexible than you'd expect, and the autofocus and optical image stabilization assure sharp pictures under just about every scenario with little effort. The OLED EVF is crisp and bright, giving an accurate rendering of images off the sensor. And while I might not recommend going all the way to ISO 100,000, the full range, up to and including 50,000, is entirely usable for capturing even the darkest environments. So whether shooting street photography or landscapes, the Q2 Monochrom is simply a fantastic choice. But only if you love photographing in black and white, and having fun while doing it. The Q2 Monochrom has just started shipping for a price of $59.95. If you're interested in purchasing the camera, I'd recommend doing so at Leica Store Miami, either by clicking right here or in the link in the video description below. Thanks for watching. Hit that like button if you found the video helpful. If you want to see more videos like this in the future, subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so you know when we post new content. As always, you can head to red.forum.com for the latest Leica news, reviews, technical articles, and more. And you can catch us every other Saturday on our live Red Dot Forum Camera Talk episodes right here on YouTube. Until then, we'll see you in the next video.